Thanks so much for the introduction. Thank you to my wonderful panel for joining us here today to discuss a little bit about how regional cooperation has really repositioned the Indo-Pacific region and the global South on the international sphere. We have some very broad discussions and issues to cover. We've already had a very, very lively pre-debate in the green room, so I am sure we're going to have a wonderful discussion also now. Now, to start us off, I was hoping to turn to former Prime Minister of Tunisia, Mehdi Juma. If you could talk a little bit to how regional formats can help, really reposition the global South on the international stage. Maybe give us some concrete examples of that you've seen in your work. Obviously, talk also about your region, Africa, and how sort of linkages between your region and the Indo-Pacific are reshaping global politics.
Thank you. First, I should say that I'm happy to participating to this second edition of Jakarta Forum, which is a real occasion to meet people from this region, but abroad as well. I think it's a part of the dynamic which is happening in this region. And it's a part of the dynamic of what we call today the global South. And globally, it's a part of the dynamic in changing. You know, we are today, in my sense, in the changing of the configuration of the world, because the management or the organizations or the way that the world was globally managed corresponds to the situation or to the configuration or the reality or the balance of power after the Second World War. And we know, all of us, that the reality is changing. A part of this change is this shift of the center of gravity of the exchanges, of the trade, of economy, from the pure Atlantic axle to the Indo-Pacific. And I think your question is joining exactly this trend, and what is happening today among this change is the will of the emerging countries or of the Indo-Pacific area to be an actor of the change and no more a market or a corridor, but to be a co-designer of the future, a co-designer of this corridor, of the logistic corridor, of the maritime, of the railways, but as well of the digital connection. And I think it's useful for the whole world to rebalance things and to create this will to grow, this will to be responsible and co-designer of the future of the world. Of course, this Indo-Pacific is open, and I'm coming from Africa, and I think it's an opportunity for us. It's an opportunity for Africa, but Africa as well is an opportunity, and it's a good thing that this multilateralism in another way to do. It's no more diplomatic multilateralism, it's economic multilateralism, it's connecting this ocean, are creating many opportunities. And I should say today that many initiatives from this region, like IMEC, which is this amazing initiative to create bridges, to create new corridors, to make things easier, quicker, and more profitable for all the region, to connect the Indo-Pacific area to the Middle East, to Africa, to Mediterranean as well. And you have key players which we are not used to see them, key players today, major key players in creating such new paths. You have India, but you have as well if you see in the Middle East, many countries, among them United Arab Emirates, In Africa, you have Kenya, and you see all these people, they are contributing, but trying to push for their own interest, the interest of the people. It's no more the situation where we are put in the path which was managed by the main powers here. And these regional powers like India, China, Brazil, if you speak about Latin America, I think it's an opportunity, but we know that is in this changing world. Like any change in any organization, even in the small organization, but you can imagine this big change, historical change. It's not easy because we are living a situation, a configuration that we know for another one, and we are in between, and it's creating trouble. And one of the things that are emerging, rising in this area is such meetings and official and formal and non-formal meetings to see how we will create opportunities, but as well how together we will contribute to manage the crisis and the troubles created by these changes, but as well when we are exposed, because it's very good to create new paths, new corridors. But if it's better if we succeed to connect all of that, to create flexibility on that, but we know that we are as well exposed to conflicts, to geopolitical conflicts, to military conflicts, to crises, and one of the design of this new future is how we organize ourselves to face that and to solve that in a peace way, allowing to get the advantage of resistance and not to transform it in radicalization of different camps to confront our interests. I think that, and I hope that this trouble or this transition period between the known and mastered configuration to the new one, which is corresponding to the new world, will be well managed, because we need another governance, another multilateralism, another taking into account of all of the people, another inclusive managing configuration. I hope that we have the wiseness to really succeed this transition period without a trouble, but with successful for all the people in this region and in all the region. And my thought is to Africa, which is one of the biggest potential. And I hope that we will succeed in Africa to create the same dynamic that you have created here in the region. And I believe that we have all the ingredients to succeed.
Thank you so much. And also for speaking to both the regional aspect and regional cooperation, the opportunities that we see with a new world order emerging, also some of the challenges, but also how this regional cooperation is the responsibility really to speak to global issues as well. Shifting to Zhuja, as a European teaching in Asia, I wanted to ask you to speak a little bit to how Euro-Atlantic security and the Indo-Pacific are increasingly linked, and maybe how regional cooperation in both regions can play together, or maybe address, separate issues as well, how they're increasingly intertwined, and how they can, again, address global issues as well and help towards greater security. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. It's really my pleasure to join this panel, and also thank you to the organizers for pulling us again together in having this wonderful conversation, or series of conversations, I should say. I would like to carry your optimism and also pick out the word opportunity that you used a couple of times. And I would like to approach connectivity from the perspective of opportunity, because I think we have the tendency to start with, and I was going to start with the fact that the world is going through a lot of changes and that we are de-risking, diversifying. And I think this is the natural outcome of the kind of global chaos that we live in. But I think we need to identify opportunities for connectivity. And I think my experience as a European living in Asia for the past 5 years, in particular in Taiwan, but also traveling a lot in Southeast Asia, is that I think we definitely are on the same page in terms of everyone wanting options. And I think if I have to talk about ASEAN and how ASEAN approaches connectivity and connecting with Europe, I think this is one line that I always I hear, that we want alternatives and we see Europe as a reliable partner, but we want ourselves to negotiate our projects. And I think this is something that you also talked about, to co-design projects. And I think as a European, if I look at how we look at the world from Brussels or from Paris or Budapest, I think we often have a very different picture of the world. And then when I sit in Taipei, or I come to Jakarta, I go to Manila, I come across a very different world view. And I think we have a mismatch between expectations. And I think one of the challenges that we're facing is to how to really align our expectations, how to align our priorities. And I think if I, again, have to come back to the European approach to the question of connectivity and de-risking, I would like to talk a little bit about Global Gateway. Perhaps definitely this is not an easy subject to discuss, because I think Global Gateway remains unknown in most part of the world. And I am myself surprised how little the European Union has done to promote its own connectivity strategy that essentially is meant to promote trusted connectivity. And it's almost also has been projected as a response to China's BRI. And I think when you look at this from Europe's perspective, it makes sense for Europeans, because Europe feels that with the assertiveness of China on the global stage and the fear of losing competitiveness, we have to come up with a new strategy, a new alternative that really brings connectivity from Africa to Europe, to Latin America and the Asia-Pacific. But when you project the Global Gateway in terms of being a response to the Belt and Road Initiative, you get a very different reaction. And that's been my personal experience, that I don't think in most parts of Southeast Asia, Southeast Asians want to hear that we want to engage the region because we fear of losing out and because we want to counter another global power that happens to be a very important partner for countries in the region. So I think, again, we need to rethink how we approach each other. And I think when it comes to connectivity, we also often, I think, reduce it to transportation and roads and highways. But there's also the digital aspect, there's the people-to-people connectivity dimension. And I think there, again, as a European, I would like to highlight that that's something that we have really put a lot of emphasis on. But again, to what extent we manage to deliver on the ground, I think that's where I'm most concerned, because there is a huge disconnect between the rhetoric, and I think that's where Europeans have often sought to project a different image than what they can deliver. So expectations are unmet, and I think IMEC, as you mentioned already, I think faces a similar challenge. And I think there have been calls for the Europeans to be very serious about how they approach IMEC, to, for example, nominate an EU-level coordinator that coordinates between the different DGs in the Commission, because I think if you look at the EU, obviously it is a very fragmented and multi-level, multi-layered governance structure. So it's hard to engage with it because it's not one government, it's not one entity. And I think what we face as a challenge is, how do we coordinate better ourselves? And when we engage the world in this new rebalanced or hopefully rebalanced global order, can we lead? And I think I'll end on this note, because I think the term leadership is something that we already heard in previous panels. And I think it's more a question than the ability. We still lack the ability to really see the leadership that really is required to really co-create projects on the ground that are not imposed top-down, but negotiated bottom-up.
Thank you so much, Shuja, for speaking to both the many opportunities and sort of keeping the optimism and the direction in the conversation, but also highlighting that some of the challenges, are on the ground, really producing concrete initiatives. I think something that we need to highlight over and over again. There has been a lot of talk about cooperation, but you also highlighted then some of the challenges that are often go back to, as you said, mismatched expectations, that we still, despite a huge dynamism now in terms of regional cooperation, but also coming now from different regions. You mentioned Europe, looking beyond traditional ways of cooperation. There's still a big kind of gap between the theory and how the cooperation will actually work out. So I wanted to turn to you, Ephraim, to speak also a little bit to how then maybe diplomacy, corridor diplomacy, can help in reducing that gap in expectations, and how we can really work towards both across, especially for the Indo-Pacific and Africa, making sure that the sort of new dynamism behind cooperation also then gets us concrete results.
Thank you so much, Julia. Thank you, Zusha. Thank you, Mehdi, for the previous comments. My name is Ephraim Pasi-Kenyanito. I am a lawyer from Kenya, currently based in Tanzania. And I've worked across the region on issues on trade, technology, media and telecommunications law. So it's good you've talked about that diplomacy. And there's a quote which I can't remember who said it about diplomacy. That the best diplomat is one who will tell you to go to hell and you will look forward to going there. I think most of you have had that term. It's about, I think the core of that quote was about understanding the person and being empathetic, that the person really feels that you've connected and they feel that you have their interests at heart. So coming from Africa and having been having studied the history and everything, you need to understand that we need to look at, whenever we are dealing with other partners, dealing with ourselves, we need to be aware of what is going on. So for example, like this African Union Agenda 2063 and the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, of which 54 out of 55 African Union member states have signed and 48 member states have agreed to liberalize and reduce 90% of trade barriers within 5 to 10 years, depending on development. So when engaging external partners, the challenge is we need to evolve from what external partners can build in Africa to how Africa can leverage these partnerships for capacity building. So understanding to the meeting at that level, moving from a dependent to a strategic partner. So this requires prioritizing, moving from physical infrastructure to software. I'll use the analogy of software versus hardware. So moving from from hardware to software. So the hardware is there. There's attempts at cross-border cooperation, but then the software, how do we institutionalize these various amazing software, but how do we make the software is consistently used, tweaked to ensure that whenever there's bugs, they are fixed in time and they are rolled out and there's good user experience. So this is the same thing when it comes to diplomacy and the cooperation across the region. So just basically strategic autonomy is codified in law and institutions, not slogans. Most of these meetings, conferences, there's a lot of slogans, but then we need to ensure that whenever African nations are meeting and meeting some of these partners, IMEC, ASEAN, the Global Gateway, which is working, has 138 flagship projects in Africa. African nations must negotiate from strength and redefine themselves from aid recipients to strategic partners. So codifying some of this in the contracts. As we are doing some of these partnerships, it's good we are opening the world, we are doing cross-border cooperation, but we need the software to be sound and to be mutually beneficial, to be rooted in mediation and dispute resolution that is views long-term retention of relationships across various institutions. So basically the same thing, being empathetic, being aware that your partner's needs versus your own needs, and how to meet each other. So this is how I view the cooperation between Africa and some of these various emerging partnerships. So software versus hardware, and being empathetic, being diplomatic. I think that's it in short. Yeah, but I can speak more. Yeah, but I'm not resting the time. Thanks.
Thank you so much for giving us some concrete pictures as well, in terms of how diplomacy and the diplomatic aspect of this can and should work. Atit, I wanted to turn to you now to also speak maybe a little bit more about the trade aspect of the corporation, and also how different actors, you come from the private sector, so how sort of international organizations, regional organizations, what the role is also of the private sector in increasing connectivity across the region. And also in terms of trade. Trade is obviously an issue that is keeping us maybe busier than we thought these days, both the economic and trade aspects experts as well as the security ones. So how also this connectivity can help position the global south in the direction of global trade.
Thank you. First of all, thank you to ORF and the organizers for inviting me for this panel discussion. For us to, just a small background for us to understand the changing dynamics at this moment. As we know that the current global order is based on just after the Second World War. Having one big event which happened was the fall of Cold War. The stopping of Cold War, which kind of generated a period of capitalist growth of all the economies. But during that, what happened is, and the recent phenomena, what we see is that broadly what we see is that the middle class in the developed world, there is this activism, and that is why you see political ramifications. The current tariffs being imposed by US is coming out of a political reality of this middle class wanting their voice to be heard. And it's the same in Europe. So that is one part of it. The second part is the demographic dividends which are coming in the global south, like Asia, India, Middle East, and then Africa. That is making these economies bigger, growing faster, and that is where today the global south actually is looking and deserves its voice in the global arena, and how the future has to be shaped. Just to give you an example, today the e-commerce market in Asia is going to be 230 billion by end of this decade. India is growing at somewhere around 6.5% CAGR by the end of this decade. Middle East, the luxury market in Middle East is also growing somewhere around 7% till the end of this decade. Asia-Africa trade is valued at 70 billion, okay? So this basically very clearly shows that, there has to be some shift of the say of global south from a geopolitical point of view. And then we also have that these changing trade flows is also making it very important that connectivity is taken care of. The recent issues which we faced in Red Sea, which basically Suez Canal, our routings were Suez Canal, we are gone back to the old routing of going around the Cape of Good Hope for a large part of our trade. So in this context, these trade lane, this corridors which we are thinking about, like IMEC, which can be one of the alternative. It may not be replacing Suez in the future, but it has to be an alternate solution. Is very important. The global gateway for Africa, that is also very important. And from this point of view, these investments are very important. Some of those conceptually may look difficult at this moment because of the issue in Israel and Gaza, because IMEC has been it's going to route through Israel, and that is something which is an issue. But today, what we see is Middle East looking at itself as this, one of the connecting points for this connectivity. You see Middle East having almost a plan of $50 billion of investments in its port infrastructure, and they want to be the center of connectivity between ASEAN, India, and Africa and Europe. So that is one of the things which Gulf is doing. From a private sector point of view, if you ask me, I'll give you an example of what CMA-CGM, the company for which we work for. We already have investments in Nhava Sheva in India and in Mundra in India, with investments in Khalifa Port in UAE, and also planning investments in Saudi Arabia. Now, this is the first leg which is actually operating on IMEC, and we already have our investments looking, being positive about this corridor. We have our first investments there. And as this corridor actually improves in the future, we will be having our, looking at participating in that. So the private sector definitely is looking at this as a need and looking at it positively, but we'll have to see how it goes. Thanks.
Thank you so much. We are already approaching the end of our discussion. I wanted to give you all the opportunity to react to each other, but I also very much wanted to invite questions from the room. So what I suggest is that we open it up for questions now. We're going to collect a few questions and then come back to the panel for to answer those questions and also for some closing remarks. If you could please give a show of hand. I believe there's a mic in the room, and if you could please introduce yourselves and keep your questions short and pointed, and if you wish, also addressed to a specific person on the panel.
Okay, should we understand that we were so clear on need to ask you questions? And no, I think maybe I will add something to the shift and the advantage to get this global south of this region contributing, because we have as well big issues we did not speak about today, but which are present. We spoke about all this geopolitical change, all this economic and trade shift. But don't forget that we have challenges like the climate change. And what is positive that we see in each contribution of these actors like India, Indonesia, Brazil, or in the Middle East, there is a big concern, and they are taking into account all the environment, climate, and we have to be the change of the climate. We have to pay attention in these corridors, not to generate more carbon footprint, but to reduce that. And that's a good thing, really, that we see these countries. I remember 10, 20 years ago, the discussion is with Europe and United States is to say that you took 1 century using developing your industry and emitting carbon. So give us not a century, but a destiny to do that. And we see the change in this region, in this area, in these countries, which are maybe more stressing and more emphasis in this environment and the climate change, and to a new development, to a growth which is inclusive and taking into account the protection of our future through the mastering and the protection of the climate.
Thank you so much, Zsuzsa.
So I was just wondering, because Ephraim, you also talked about, in your experience, about African countries wanting to move to strategic partnerships. And I think I also heard to my right side here that the question of the global South, not just wanting, but deserving to have its own voice. I think these are the conversations that in Europe, I would say, are much more frequent now. So again, perhaps I'm always on the positive side, but I think we are moving in the direction where we understand that we need to really change the approach. And I know I've said that before, but I think it's very important for the Europeans, at least, when they approach the region, to know how to do it, because it's not enough to have investment. And it's actually not enough to have a geopolitical agenda. You need to align that with the private sector. And I think that's a really big challenge also for the European de-risking agenda, because I think we can all read about the Commission's ambitions on paper and also in her statements coming out from the President of the European Commission. But we have to ask the question whether the private sector has the same interest, if they are aligned. Because for us Europeans, I think our de-risking hangs on the private sector's delivering on what we see as a geopolitical priority. And I think that's where everything gets geopolitical and geoeconomic. But if I may just turn to you with that question, do you think that in this new global environment, do you think countries in your region are actually able to have more agency? And do you see them being more able to really move in that strategic partnership direction and demand and negotiate and not be recipients of aid? If I may ask that question to you.
Thank you so much for that question. So that is the ambition. As I mentioned, Africa has the Agenda 2063 vision, which was agreed upon by all the 55 member states of the African Union. And it's still an ambition. We are still getting there. As you know, Africa is not homogeneous. It's different. For example, from the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, you've noticed some countries have committed 10 years to liberalize the economy. Some countries have said 5 years, depending on development status. So that's the same thing. So you'll note that it's not an even market. But then as part of 2063 agenda, there's been reforms at the AU whereby African countries are beginning to negotiate as Africa, as a bloc, and less as country X or country Y. There's still bilateral negotiations, but they are being fed still to the Agenda 2063. So even if, for example, you'll note a country, say for example, I come from Kenya, you'll note that, for example, Kenya had negotiated a deal with the European Union on trade, and it went through the East Africa Court of Justice, whether it contradicts the commitments that Kenya has to the rest of the East African Community member states and to the African Union Continental Free Trade Agreement commitments. And the court was able to give a good direction on that. So there's the thing whereby member states, yes, will negotiate, but then they need to keep in mind of their commitment under Africa. So that will enable Africa to negotiate as one, and will enable the push towards South-to-South cooperation, towards diversifying the partnerships beyond the traditional partnerships, and also ensuring that to move from the narrative that Africa is a place for resource extraction, but for a place for strategic partnerships. So moving from resource extraction towards strategic partnerships, long-term thinking, and just, to conclude, these Silk Acts present a generational opportunity. African success hinges not on the quantity of concrete poured, but on the quantity of the legal frameworks we build to uphold equity, defend our rights, and assert our autonomy. As I mentioned, autonomy is not in slogans, but in the software, in the hard contracts that exist. So yes, there's been bilateral agreements which sometimes have not favored certain countries, but then you're moving towards Africa-wide agreements or regional economic community-wide agreements that would benefit the entire region as one, and moving towards Africa Agenda 2063, and in line with the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement that 54 to 55 member states have signed that agreement, which is very, very progressive. Thank you.
Thanks so much for addressing Juja's question and also broadening out a little bit more. We are exactly out of time, actually, but I still want to attend to you as well, Atit, for some closing remarks.
Yeah. So just as you said, whether we need to ensure whether the private sector is interested. But what has happened is, prior to the recent developments in geopolitics, to a large extent, even though the shifts of like global south, those kind of geopolitical were there, but they were kind of, it was possible to look at the trajectory of geopolitics in a linear way to some extent. In the recent times, it has disrupted, and frankly, you don't know how things are going to be happening. So that is why you will see private sector now tracking geopolitical events more closely and trying to see where they can participate and where they can enable. But the most important thing, like what we think in CMA CGM, is that we cannot be the deciders. We can be only the enablers. And how the trajectory happens, accordingly, we will be following that and try to grow in a responsible and a sustainable way. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Atit. Thanks to all of you, really. We started discussing before the panel. I'm sure we have a lot of things to discuss also now that the panel has come to an end and in future formats. For now, I want to thank you all for your contribution. Thank you all for coming. And thank you, of course, also to our wonderful hosts here in Jakarta for having us and enabling these kind of formats.